Thank you all very much for your presentations. And I must admit that I was particularly struck because all of you pointed out that it's really unprecedented in law to criminalize conduct for a young person that's legal for an adult. And it's particularly disconcerting to hear that a law that is supposed to help youth with the criminal system decriminalize is in fact going to create a worse situation, and that is hardly what we should be doing. So I'd like to ask you, what is misconceived then in this legislation? I know you all spoke to it, and you listed some amendments or suggestions, recommendations, but I'd like to be a little crisper and sharper if I could. So what is misconstrued, and what measures should be in place to protect youth in this legislation?
You want all three groups to
yes,
respond?
Please.
Okay, well, we'll start with the same order, Criminal Law Association.
To be succinct and brief, what's misconstrued in this legislation is the continued criminalization of marijuana. It should be treated no different than tobacco and alcohol. We haven't seen a reduction in smoking rates for tobacco amongst our youth because we've criminalized it. The criminal code, and you've heard this before from other criminal defense lawyers, is a blunt tool to deal with social problems. So at the very least, what can be fixed here? I'm not naive enough to think that this committee is going to remove the criminalization of marijuana from Bill C-45, but at the least we can stop there from being any disparities between youth and adult. And when you're looking at youth, it's very important to look at their specific context. Youth are only allowed to possess, it's illegal for them to possess 5 grams or more. That's a lot for a youth. Youths often carry around their marijuana in their backpack. They often pool their money to buy their marijuana, and so they may have greater amounts than they would normally carry. Youth are in a special circumstance and a special place for how they conduct themselves, and we recognize in the Youth Criminal Justice Act that youths are less mature, they're less forward-thinking, and they're less amenable to whatever scrap of deterrence can be found in criminal law. So if 100 years of strict criminalization hasn't stopped them, certainly this won't. And not only is there the charter problems with the inequality between youth and adults, but we're going to have a continuation of the stigma, the criminalization that we see in the current law. The worst thing that can happen to a youth who is in possession of marijuana is that they are introduced to the criminal law and fall down that rabbit hole of continuing offenses.
Bar Association.
I think there are perhaps two parts to the answer I'd like to give. First, misconceptions, and secondly, measures to protect youth. One of the big misconceptions, as I mentioned, is people thinking come royal assent or proclamation, it's a totally legal situation with respect to marijuana. It has to be made very clear this is not the case. There are going to be limited non-criminal exceptions to the possession of cannabis. That is all that is happening here. So, first of all, that message has to be gotten out. The second thing is, if we're looking at protecting youth, you have to look at much, much better communication, much more education, and this is something that involves not only the government, the national government, but the provinces, the municipalities, boards of education, and social organizations. People have to understand that it is there are dangers associated with drug use, and I know this committee has heard from many highly qualified people about those dangers. The message has to be gotten across on so many levels and change attitudes, and that's not going to happen overnight, but it has to start.
Monsieur Levesque.
Just
ideally speaking, basically, if we authorize adults to have up to 30 grams and youth up to 5 grams, essentially that means that the limit is 30 grams, but we are authorizing the provinces to set out criminal offences up to 30 grams. And that's a bad thing because it is a penalty at the end of the day, but it wouldn't be a criminal offence. And the barreau has looked and delved into the bill, and a number of provinces have made amendments to their own local legislation. So the lesser of two evils would be to clarify in Bill C-45 that when it comes to youth, the principles, objectives of the legislation for the youth criminal justice system is what must take precedence. At the bar, we've already proposed an amendment to that effect before another Senate committee, and it reads as follows. And it would come after Clause 5.1. It is understood that nothing in the current legislation should be interpreted to limit the provisions of the law on the youth criminal justice system, particularly when it comes to a warning, a referral, or an extrajudicial penalty, such that offenders, community law and order officers could, in fact, get around the problem of penalisation by allowing the youth criminal justice system to take precedence. Now, it isn't quite clear as things stand, and if it's not clear to lawyers, it certainly won't be clearer to police officers, let alone our youth.
Okay, I want to inject a question right here. If we wanted to keep the criminalization of the big players in this, the people that are selling this stuff, producing this stuff, importing this stuff or whatever, the real criminal element we talk about is part of the big industry that's out there. How would we do that, but at the same time taking it out of the criminalization of young people, or even people that are just casually giving a weed back and forth, or whatever these other minor offenses are? Now we can have fines for some, but and maybe we could have some sort of system of restorative justice for the younger people particularly. But how do we limit it just to the big players, or as it would have been back in the 20s and 30s when they're bringing alcohol out of prohibition? What would we do to stop the bootleggers, the big industry going? Anyway, your comments on that would be appreciated. Okay,
Well, there's
start with the bar.
Okay. A variety of things that can be done. I don't profess to have all the answers, of course, but if you have a regime whereby perhaps, for lack of a better term, microcultivation is permitted, so that people can produce realistic amounts for their own use and for the use of some other people, and distribute those. That way you could have a sort of cottage industry, for lack of a better term, in distribution. That can be an accepted thing, so the persons who are involved in these massive boatload operations would not be permitted by the Act. The Act would be set tolerable levels, or a certain level of tolerance, so that people are not criminalized in these lower areas. The big issue, though, is making sure that there is not profit, because where there is profit to be made, you will have illegal activity. And that's why it's a more complex area, such as taxation, government setting rates, and so on. And if you have perhaps a micro distribution, micro processing, cottage industry, that may open up or remove profit from a large section. I can't say that it's going to work, but it is worth a consideration, Senator.
Interesting idea. Anybody? Yes?
Yeah, so I mean, the other thing that you can do is you can remove simple possession of cannabis from the criminal code, so that you're allowed to possess cannabis. And in terms of trafficking, You can build in exceptions for small amounts or close in age exceptions to eliminate sort of the really distasteful examples that come from this bill about an 18-year-old passing a joint to his 17-year-old friend. Because the one thing that we know from our case law is that the definition of trafficking is very, very broad. And so to ameliorate some of those effects, you can build in exceptions, but I think the starting point is to treat tobacco or to treat cannabis like we treat tobacco and alcohol. Its possession should be removed from the criminal code, and then provinces can deal with it in other mechanisms that don't carry quite as much stigma as criminal code offenses do.
Monsieur Levesque?
On peut aussi ajouter.
We could also add the following. It's a matter of paradigms. No matter who commits the offense, by virtue of what it is set out in the Act, if the individual is younger than 18, then the intervener must innately react by saying, we're not talking about the same individual. These aren't the people that we are targeting with the law. These aren't big players. But there must remain some discretionary authority for those on the ground, because organized crime, the big players, can use young people, teenagers, to commit crimes with their operations, and the youth may not understand the first, second, or third time. There is repeat behavior. Over time, the act can have its full impact. But the first reflex, I would say, would be to say that the law must set out clearly that if we're dealing with a young person, those we want to protect, the first reaction, the first reflex must be, we won't treat that person the same way. Thank you.